Well, Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 151 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is chastity, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we're covering the cardinal virtue of temperance here. We're looking at the subjective parts, and we are moving on to the third and final subjective part of temperance, which is chastity. Then we'll look at virginity, then the vice of lust, and then the parts of lust, which is quite extensive. So then we're finishing up the last part of subjective parts of temperance. Now, is chastity a virtue in itself? And the answer St. Thomas gives is yes, because chastity takes its name from the fact that it chastises things. Chastity, you can think of chastise, it's the same root word. And what chastity does is it chastises concupiscence. Those are those pleasures and desires of the flesh. So in some ways, we use it typically in form in dealing with sexual matters, but in some ways it kind of just like abstinence has a more universal metaphorical perspective, and sobriety has a metaphorical perspective. Chastity in some ways does too, since it kind of, in a general sense, keeps the concupiscible appetites at bay. And using this, St. Thomas uses this idea of this, he takes it from Aristotle, the childish desires. The temperance falls into effect the childish desires. So, in terms of getting what you want, when you want, and you just seek pleasure and you don't think about the depth of things or the teleology of your actions, you're just seeking the pleasure. Chastity holds it into effect. So, in some ways, people who never mature, never grow up, never quite get chastity. Chastity requires you to be like a parent to yourself. It chastises your own passions and puts them in the right order, which will ultimately lead you to the greatest amount of happiness, just like a parent who properly disciplines and instructs their child leads their child to become a more happy and a fulfilled adult. If you spoil your child and give them whatever they want, they typically do not, right, until they grow up, and then they have to figure it out on their own. But a good parent chastises, right? So likewise, as a good Christian, we should chastise ourselves in order to put our concupiscible appetites in order. Chastity also moderates those sexual desires. That's part of that chastisement. Now, this isn't chastisement. Chastity is not the same as celibacy. It's not the same, but it's using it in a moderate way. So even husbands and wives are chaste, even though they're not celibate. Chastity is about having sexual passions fulfilled in act in the right order, the ordinate amount of sexual activity with the right people, person, in the right place, in the right time, right? It's all about the who, what, where, when, to put it in the right order. Now, is chastity a special virtue or is it a general virtue? Like most things that are special virtues, they are also general virtues in some way. So chastity is a special virtue because it's dealing with a special matter, namely sex. So since sex is a very powerful and important part of being a human person, right? Without it, there is no continuation of the species. Therefore, it's rather essential to the species, not necessarily to the individual, but to the species. It's essential to be able to regulate sex in a healthy way, in the proper ordering, is a special virtue. You can see that would be a very important thing to do is to regulate that. And then in a metaphorical sense, it is a general virtue. So chastity in a bigger way, right? Not just in terms of sexual act, but uh, religious talk about this more. But this idea of refraining from delighting in union with any other thing other than God. So not being too bound to anything, right? Not necessarily in a sexual way, but chastity being open. So think of a cloistered sister not getting too attached to her houseplant. For example, she might have very little in her room, but not getting too attached to her houseplant or a particular set of sandals or a tunic, right? So that she can be entirely free to be open to God. That's perfect chastity. It's not because those other things were used in a sexual way. It is just to be completely open to God and without anything getting in the way, whether it's a sexual relationship or another object. That's chastity in a general sense. But mostly what we're talking about is chastity in terms of its being a special virtue, in terms of actual sexual activity. That's how it really relates most to temperance. Now, the third article is chastity distinct from abstinence? And it is. Um, Temperance is about the concupiscible appetites, mostly dealing with pleasures of touch. So that's dealing with food, alcohol, and sex. Those are the three that we're mostly dealing with. Chastity deals with the venereal pleasures, the sexual pleasures, whereas abstinence is dealing with the pleasures of the palate, of food. Um, Therefore, they're dealing with regulating different aspects of the concupiscible appetites. They're different aspects of touch. How you regulate touch is not necessarily how you regulate abstinence isn't the same as chastity, and chastity isn't the same as abstinence. So they just have to be treated differently, right? How you take care of your hand is not how you take care of your foot. They're similar, but they're not the same. St. Augustine has this great line because often St. Augustine is quoted for saying that the temporal, the sins of the flesh are the least damning of the sins. But then you have the apparitions at Fatima that said a great number of people are in hell or in purgatory because of sins of the flesh. So you get a bit of a dichotomy there. But then you can see from this line that St. Augustine's not so free with sins of the flesh either. He says, I consider that nothing so casts down the manly mind from its heights as the fondling of women and those bodily contacts which belong to the married state. Nothing so much casts down the manly mind. So you don't want to take the issues of chastity too lightly. Certainly not from a misquote of St. Augustine. Now, the fourth one, the final article, is does purity belong to chastity? Now, purity takes its name from pudor, which means shame. So the arguments, the objections are, well, shame deals with everything, not just chastity, right? And is shame even a virtue? If you recall back to the integral parts of temperance, shamefacedness is an integral part of temperance, so it is in there. But St. Thomas says it is something that's particularly bound to chastity because shame, if it's dealing with shame, what is the thing that man deals most with shame? Where's shame come from? Mostly sexual things. Sexual things. You think of Adam and Eve's first shame. It was they were naked in the garden, right? Shame in a sexual way is at the heart of it. Um, So purity and chastity are related in that, in terms of regulating the sexual parts. But St. Thomas also breaks it down a little bit further, where purity indicates desires, thoughts, actions. Right? Purity is a bigger umbrella than chastity. Chastity is dealing more with actions in terms of it being a special virtue. The actions, sexual actions. Um, so if a person is unchaste, then they are impure because their desires, their thoughts, and their actions were impure. But not all impurity is unchastity. So if a person has desires that are impure, they're not necessarily unchaste in that as a special virtue, right? In that generalized virtue, right? The generalized way, the metaphorical way, then yes, they're the same. Right? I guess chastity and purity are the same metaphorically in terms of being a special virtue in a specific way. Chastity and purity are different. And the difference is that purity is a broader way because it doesn't require a physical act. So in conclusion, chastity is a virtue because it regulates sexual desires, the concupiscible appetite. Chastity is a special virtue because it regulates specifically sexual acts. And metaphorically, it exists too, where one would be always open to God primarily first. Chastity is distinct from abstinence, since chastity regulates the sexual appetites versus abstinence, which regulates the palate, issues of savory of the palate. And chastity is related to purity, since all unchaste acts are also impure. So next we will be moving on to virginity.